So, as Zach just mentioned, my name is Clayton Barber, and I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk to all of you about something that I think is extremely critical: emotional gaps. The concept of an emotional gap is something that's extremely abstract, even to me. And so, before we delve into exactly what an emotional gap is and how do we fix them, I think it's very important that we first highlight the different kinds of emotions that we can experience in our daily lives and the different things that come together to shape how we feel. In the broadest sense of the word, there are three different types of emotions that we can experience: primary, descriptive, and secondary emotions. Primary emotions are emotions of experience, emotions of engagement, and emotions of expression. These are the emotions that you experience in your daily lives as the result of a conversation that you have, of something that you're doing, of an experience that you have. And these are the emotions that you visibly display on your person. If I'm extremely angry, I would appear a very specific way: forward, engaged, tight, close to the belt. Whereas if I'm happy, I would likely be much more relaxed. And these are emotions that we can pick up on extremely easily through our body's ability to take in different pheromones and different endorphins that we release. But that only goes so far, because primary emotions are a mechanism that only allow us to experience a very narrow range of things, whereas descriptive emotions are a mechanism that we have developed for ourselves to give context to our primary emotions. In the center, you'll find the 6 different in the primary emotions: 3 negative and 3 positive. These emotions are extremely, extremely vague. But these are the emotions that we get in the response to the question, how are you feeling, the most, more than anything else. If I ask any one of my residents or anyone on my staff, anyone in my class, I would likely get one of those 6 words in the center or a synonym thereof more often than I would get any descriptive emotion, anything that gives me context or reason to understand what they're going through, what's going on with them. And that's very, very important, because our ability to understand each other ranges on our ability to understand not only what we see, but what we experience. And if we can experience things together, we can understand each other better. And so using that outer ring, those descriptive emotions, to give ourselves context for exactly how we're feeling, we enable ourselves to not only experience things in a more specific way, but also to communicate exactly how we feel and exactly what we're experiencing much, much better. That third category, though, secondary emotions, the outer ring, are extremely different from primary and descriptive emotions. Secondary emotions, unlike their expressive and experiential counterparts, are emotions of thought, and they are both emotions of the conscious and subconscious mind, meaning that while primary emotions are extremely focused on exactly how you feel at any given time, secondary emotions are the emotions that take us much, much longer to process. Days, they last with us for weeks, months, years. These are the emotions such as love, such as guilt, such as pride, that we can think about, reflect on, and alter ourselves, whereas primary emotions, we don't have that luxury. However, the mechanisms that we've created in our current state as a society have caused us to suppress our primary emotions, particularly our primary emotions on the negative side of the spectrum. Of those 6, we allow in our professional relationships only the positive 3: power, pride, joy, and ultimately peacefulness, and different permutations thereof and different descriptors. However, we've restricted ourselves greatly for how we're allowed to feel, and it's caused this over-reliance on these secondary emotions, these long-lasting emotions of the conscious mind, rather than our inherent emotions and our ability to understand different things. And this has caused a very stark increase in depression and anxiety, both in the United States and on the global scale. This over-reliance on secondary emotions has led to a 4% increase in just 1 year. At the turn of the millennium, from 1999 to 2000, there was a 4% increase in the rate of depression, diagnosed depression, not people classifying themselves, but medically diagnosed depression and anxiety in the United States. And at this point, in the year 2015, we're at a roughly 5.35% range of the global population being similarly diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Now that's a terrifying statistic. It's a terrifying statistic to me. When you think of 5% of billions and billions of people, you get much, much more than the campus body here on campus. You get a very large portion of the population of the United States. Now that over-reliance, why is that? Why have we created this culture where I can't express how I feel in a professional setting? How did we get here? That's a very hard question to answer, and it's a question that dates back to about 80 years ago with the concept of generations. There are 4 generational archetypes that different generations can embody. And so beginning from the silent generation, which originated back in 1925, and all the way through our current generation, the Millennials, you have 4 different archetypes that these embody. They are the artist generation, the prophet generation, the nomad generation, and finally the hero or civic generation. To bring to forefront the artist generation, not necessarily the root of the problem, but certainly a contributor to it. The artist generation, in our current time, the silent generation, is a generation that was raised in a very lax environment. They were born into a time of crisis. They lived through the Second World War, and that was really the time of their upbringing. However, because so many of the elder population, the lost generation at the time, was focused on fighting battles overseas or dealing with a lot of secular and societal problems, they were really given free rein of themselves, which allowed them to first address their own personal needs rather than have to focus on societal or secular issues at a very young age, which allowed them to explore themselves, which allowed them to develop their own identity. And that's the key part, because emotions are really, at their core, at their root, a way to understand yourself and a way to classify how you feel. And so, given their ability to already understand that, they were able to sort of spur this awakening out of the crisis, out of the Second World War. They were able to birth a generation that was extremely focused on their own societal issues. They were extremely self-aware and directed that self-awareness to a larger societal context. The baby boomers, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the baby boomers refers to a generation birthed almost immediately at the close of the Second World War that was raised through the Cold War and exists still today in their elder years. The baby boomers as a generation, unlike the silent generation, grew up in a very strict household, in contrast to the silent generation. This strict upbringing caused them to have to first focus on secular issues and societal issues rather than allowing them to identify their own needs and develop their own identity. That trend continues if you examine how the baby boomers raised the nomads, Generation X. My parents, for most of us in the audience, all the students here, these are going to be your parents as well. The Generation Xers were brought up in a time of cultural awakening, cultural awareness, similar to the silent generation. And they were given the most freedom out of any of the 4 generational archetypes. They had the ability to do almost anything in the name of identity development and in the name of self-awareness. And this allowed them to similarly be acutely aware of who they were from a very young age. But why is it that you keep seeing this back and forth pattern? Why is it that every generation raises their children in a different environment? Is it because of the societal trends or something much deeper? Mechanically, we're all aware of our own flaws. I know exactly what's wrong with me. I might be too lazy to fix a lot of my own flaws, but I'm acutely aware of them. And so I might see it as my own personal duty to ensure that none of my children have those same flaws that I do. And so if I look back at my parents and I say, this is the one problem. Because they gave me too much freedom, I now know that because I always procrastinate, never do my homework, all of these different issues that I might be having, it's all because I had too much freedom. So I'm going to raise my children in a very secure and closely run environment. And so you have this teeter-totter effect. And that exists too with our generation, the Millennials. While Generation X was allowed a lot of freedom and a lot of luxury in their early years, our generation, on a societal level, this may not be true for everyone, was raised in very strict households. Not in the sense that you had to wake up when you had to wake up, you had to go to sleep when you had to go to sleep, but most of what you did was controlled for you. You had some say, but a large majority of it was run by your parents, by your family unit, and by those who were on your team. And it's that concept of teamwork, that concept of the team unit being defined in so many different ways, through so many different parallels, that begins to create the emotional gap that we see today. Now, the idea of teamwork is not a bad thing. The idea of teamwork is fantastic. It enables us to communicate with so many different people, to bring so many different minds to the table, to solve so many different problems in the best way that we can. But it also causes us to have this need to get along. When I work in a team, I can only perform well with that team if I am on good terms with every single one of the team members. If I'm having a disagreement, that's going to actively detract from any group discussion, from any group work that has to be done. And it might ultimately permute in the breaking down of a task or the breaking down of a team. This is true in our schoolwork, this is true in our classrooms, and this is true in the professional world. But our society has chosen to continue to emphasize these teams, to continue to bring some of the best minds together to solve our problems, both business and personal. And that's fantastic. But what we need to also understand is the need for negative emotion in that space. It's best, that need is best characterized by the difference between these two generations. I feel like Apple did it best when they were trying to represent the two generations in contrast with one another. There was a very old commercial, I hope some of you in the room still remember it, that represented one operating system against the other. And I feel like it really sums up the difference between the Millennials and Generation X. But not that commercial. This one. The one that represents exactly how aware of our identities we are at any given time. I, as a millennial, had to take a lot more time and really sit down and think about my identity. And why is that? It's because I wasn't required. It's because I, personally, as well as many of the other millennials, suppressed my negative primary reflexive emotions in my youth and in the classroom and in a business context. And why is that? It's because of that team focus. So this is really the problem of the millennials. We have this need. We have this intrinsic process that we go through of suppressing our negative emotions that causes us to become overly reliant on our secondary emotions. If I have to experience a minor annoyance in the context of love, in the context of guilt, in the context of pride, that takes a lot of thought, that takes a lot of reflection. Doing all of that and trying to process all of that information that I would normally experience in the moment with these much larger and much more conscious constructs is something that causes me to internalize all of that. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, the longer you sit on an emotion and the longer you let it stew inside of you before you let yourself talk about it, before you express how you're feeling, the more extreme that expression, that explosion of emotion is going to be. And so to address the problem of emotional gaps, to solve the problem of the millennials, we have to not look to society. We have to look to ourselves. We have to stop ourselves from suppressing primary emotions, whether positive or negative. We have to allow ourselves to understand how we feel, contextualize how we feel using primary emotions through discussion with descriptive emotions, and allow ourselves to open up conversations about that and develop the idea of why we feel a certain way. I feel like it's been a long time since I was able to have a conversation that involved constructive criticism in a professional environment. Something's always personal. So what I would ask each of you to do is the next time you're in a group setting, the next time you're working in a team, probably tomorrow, maybe even tonight, decouple yourself from your ideas. While that may sound Orwellian in nature, it's not that I'm asking you to completely disregard every idea that you've ever had and move on. They're not you. That would mean that we have no visionaries in our society. Our society needs visionaries. It needs people who are driven. It needs people who inspire themselves and inspire others. But not every single idea, not every mechanism is part of that vision. And if you can not view someone's comment or someone's expression as an affront to something that you said or something that you've created, you can start a conversation. If you articulate how you feel about something, if you say, you know, when you just told me that my approach to this problem made no sense, that kind of hurt. you might get some response. And if they don't suppress their negative emotion, if they open up that conversation, if you create that dialogue, you now have a platform, a bridge to understand where those around you are coming from and become better communicators. And that's really what the problem of emotional gaps boils down to, our inability at present to communicate to an optimal state. In order to become better communicators, we have to allow ourselves to express ourselves. So what I'm asking is not monumental. What I'm asking is not go change the world. It's to feel. Thank you.